I'm good? All right, okay. Hi, welcome everyone. It's so great to be in person. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Kylie. I know Julia sort of introduced us all, but my name is Kylie and I am the editor of Future of Good, a digital publication covering the social purpose space in Canada. And I'm so excited to be moderating this panel today, particularly with these folks who have been in their inboxes so many times over the past 2 years, and now I'm finally meeting them all in person, which is great. Before we begin, just a housekeeping note, this panel will be presented in English. So if you require simultaneous interpretation, please grab a headset from the AV table, which is somewhere, I'm not sure, at the back. Got it. And thank you so much to Equal Futures Network for bringing us together today. The Equal Futures Network is a member organization connecting more than 500 national, regional, community and grassroots organizations, agencies, civil society, and projects from across Canada that are committed to advancing gender equality and to ensuring equal futures for all. So we're here on this particular panel to talk gender equality in Canadian politics and policy. So Canada has long had a commitment to gender equality, both here at home and abroad. And the country also has a really rich civil society network pushing for more inclusive policies that will meet the real needs of women, girls, and gender diverse people. So I'm really looking forward to getting to know some solutions, some tools and insights on all of this and more from these lovely panelists, and I'll introduce them to you now. So we have Faye Johnstone, MSW, applause. Faye is the executive director and co-owner of Wisdom to Action Consulting, a social enterprise and consulting firm working with nonprofits and governments across Canada to advance 2S LGBTQI+ inclusion, improve mental health services, and address gender-based violence. Faye is a writer, equity educator, community organizer, and public policy nerd. Through Wisdom to Action, she has played a key role in advocating for bold action on 2S LGBTQI issues from the provincial and federal governments. She was on the front lines of the federal fight for trans rights in 2016 and 2017 and helped advocate for a ban on conversion practices in Canada in 2020 and 2021. Through campaign organizing, media commentary, and more, she challenges governments and elected officials to step up on 2S LGBTQI+ public policy and human rights. She was the 2019 recipient of the LGBT Youth Line's Trans Activism Award and currently serves on the board of directors for Ywca Canada. Next up, we have Anjem Sultana, an award-winning public affairs strategist. Applause, yes. Welcome, Anjem. Anjem is an award-winning public affairs strategist, sought-after media commentator, accomplished public speaker, and published health equity researcher with expertise in gender equity, public health, youth engagement, and civic engagement. Anjem is the Director of Youth Leadership and Policy Advocacy at Plan International Canada, and fellow with the Public Policy Forum, and a Canadian delegate to the W20. Anjem holds a Master's of Public Health from the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. That was a lot of public health on one, and a certificate in sustainable business strategy from Harvard Business School. Welcome, Anjem. And next we have Debbie Ywca, an award-winning Black feminist with over 8 years of local and international advocacy experience through feminist initiatives in the Ottawa-Gatineau region and through working at Oxfam Canada and Global Affairs Canada. She became the new executive director at the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity in July 2020. The center promotes diversity in gender identity, gender expression, and romantic and sexual orientation in all its forms on a national level through services in the areas of education and advocacy. Welcome, Debbie. And last but not least, we have Rain Liliefeld. I paused this time. Rain is a communications professional and relationship builder with over 19 years in the nonprofit sector. She's an activist, creative organizer, educator, and project manager with extensive experience in government and resource development. Rain has been the Director of Member Services and Development at Ywca for over 9 years. During that time, she's been responsible for strategic programs and initiatives that strengthen the Ywca movement. She has secured funding and managed projects that endeavor to move the needle forward on women's labor market access, digital literacy, ending gender-based violence. An engaged member of her community, Rain gives time to support arts, social justice, youth organizations. She's a board member of the Canadian Black History Projects and Kensington Market Jazz Festival. She also sits on the Philanthropists Editorial Advisory Committee, on the Advisory Committee for New Harlem Productions. And she's energized by the work that leads to transforming workplaces and being a good ancestor. These portfolios, wow, incredible. Okay, so let's get into it. My first question, I'd love to talk about representation. We hear a lot about representation in politics. We hear a lot in recent years about a gender balanced cabinet. We can talk about how the concept of gender balance is binary in itself, but we also know we have Canada's first woman finance minister and more. So we're hearing a lot about representation, but representation doesn't necessarily equal inclusion. So I'd love to know from your experience and your perspectives, what is the difference between representation and meaningful inclusion, and how can we move from the former to the latter? Maybe Rain, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I like to think about belonging as true inclusion. If we all feel that we belong and when we walk into spaces from jump, when we start experiencing spaces, that's what real inclusion is. And I like to think about, our colleagues in the disability justice sector, advocates who talk about ramps, right? So it's one thing to have a ramp that's going to ease folks into a space, but it's a completely different thing to think about how are they going to move around in that space? How are we going to, if it's in a store, are people going to be experiencing warmth and support from customer service reps? And so I think that it's more than just building those ramps. It also has to be about things like the training, anti-racism and anti-oppression training, support for people once they're in those spaces. And I think about our colleagues in leadership and decision-making roles who enter spaces, whether it's the legislative, whether it is, being the first Black woman on a board or as an ED. And it's about what are we experiencing in those spaces and how are we making them welcoming for ourselves? Because it's a big challenge to be the first, the only, the different, and experience that exclusionary factors. And so I think it's really important for us to look at inclusion in a way that goes beyond just welcoming, but it's about belonging, that sense of belonging. And to do that, we need proper training for staff like the gatekeeper, staff who are the safety and security experts, letting people into the building, but also our colleagues once we're at the table.
Yeah, thanks, Rain. Debbie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm going to keep it real, folks.
Good.
So, when I think about representation and the difference between inclusion, the immediate thing I think about is power. And I think that is often absent in our conversations about representation, because that's when we find ourselves going into the rabbit hole of tokenism, which for many of us who may have been the first in many spaces, I think we all know what it feels like you can feel it on your skin, how gross it feels to be tokenized. And when I talk about power, I'm talking about the power to shift the environments that we're around, that Rain had spoken about, that allows us to push the status quo. Because you can have a Black woman be in the room, the only one, but if the conditions that are around her don't allow her to speak, against or for certain issues that can push forth change, then that representation means nothing. For me, it just means a face that looks like mine, that I can see as a symbol that is significant, but what does it really mean when we need significant change? So I often talk to young people, and I often use this quote, that power likes comfort. And I think if we're going to talk about inclusion, inclusion's about disrupting that comfort so the change that we want to see can actually happen. I'm a big nerd when it comes to politics and elections, and I want to see more Black femmes, I want to see more queer people, I want to see more trans folks elected. But if the last couple of years have shown us anything, is that electoral politics in this country is scary. And so I think there's a responsibility for a lot of us who are doing this work to create a culture where more of us can run so that we can inform change at the highest level of decision making, while supporting the grassroots movements that are required to push the hands of decision making, to be fluid so we can continue to see policy that is meaningful actually come into being.
Faye, what about you?
I think I would agree, and I really like the piece about culture. I think when we talk about representation in politics, we often celebrate it as a success in and of itself without unpacking the social context that allows it to happen. And so, why do we have less women in politics? It's not because less women want to run for election, it's because the environments are toxic and inhospitable. And so I think I like to flip it on its head. Representation isn't success, it isn't the goal, it never has been. It's how do we create those social, political, and economic environments where the most marginalized women, those who are so often left out of these conversations, have every tool they need, all of the resources they need to step up to that plate and run for office. I also think, I walk into almost every space and I'm like the trans girl in the room. Which is fine. And, I think that is a good thing and a complicated thing, but it is also, how are we allowed to actually show up in space? I feel like I always have to be putting on a bit of a persona. You have to be walking, you have to be, you can't be angry at the microaggressions. You can't be peeved at the mistreatment that just comes and is communicated to you as if it's expected. And I think that's not unique to trans folks, and it's not unique to queer folks, and it's an experience many of us walk into spaces with. And my question is always, how do we allow or create environments where folks don't have to be maintaining a performance in space, where everybody can walk in and feel welcomed, feel fully reflected in that environment. And again, that takes challenging even, ourselves in these spaces. I think we often imagine that it's just like men who are maintaining power and control. Well, we know that, cis white women can do a whole lot of bad things in this world too. And we need to be willing to name that and to recognize that all of us are complicit in these systems. And that only when we recognize that and question the systems themselves are more diverse women, more racialized, more Black, more Indigenous, more trans, more queer, more poor women going to come into spaces like these.
I love that representation was never the goal. It's about what representation gets us, and if there's no opportunity for that, then what's the point? Yeah. And
yeah, just to build on a point that Debbie raised around building power, that means actually ensuring that people from all walks of life actually have decision-making control. It also means resourcing groups. It means funding groups. And I think there is a real fear around giving up power, but that is at the crux of really pushing from representation to full inclusion, is really ensuring that there is that power distribution, that equitable power distribution. I think also about, I really appreciate the point around representation is not the goal, it's perhaps on the journey. And what it should help to facilitate is real changes in the economic, political, and social conditions of folks. There's no country in the world that's achieved gender equality. We all have work to do. And I think one of the things that we need to start to push towards, and we're starting to see that, but more needs to be done, is really taking the words, the commitments, translating that into actual substantive policy change and process change, but also actually seeing that real impact on the ground. So, one of the things, in the list of things that you're also mentioning, I think what was really promising to see back in 2018 was the Canadian Gender Budgeting Act, where we were starting to show that, a budget is a political document. It dictates what are our priorities in society and where are we going to put our resources? Are we going to put our money where our mouth is? And I think there's been some evolutions there. It's become more, the goal is to become more intersectional. There's more of an age diversity lens as well. But is that actually making a change in people's lives day in, day out? That's where we need to actually ensure that process, where we're seeing that in the infrastructure, whether it's GBA plus or other things, actually makes a real change in people's lives. And I think, one of the things, just from a global perspective, Canada is the co-chair of the Action Coalition 6 in the Beijing 25 plus coalitions around feminist movements and leadership. And one of the goals that they have is actually supporting girl-led, adolescent-led, youth-led organizations and ensuring that there's flexible funding. I think when I think about this room, all the incredible work that civil society is doing, we are in many ways the life force of this country, really ensuring that gender equality continues to be advanced. We aren't rolling back, but we need to support civil society, and we need to ensure that there's not undue conditionalities on it. It's flexible. It works for communities as they need it. So I think, if we're talking about moving from representation to inclusion, we also need to build the processes to support that.
Yeah, and I want to ask a follow-up on that, because I know that, I know that part of that is the freedom for civil society organizations to be political, right? And to do political advocacy. And I know that's not always been the case. So what you all do political advocacy, policy advocacy rather, and what have been your experiences around that? How have you felt constraints, or what do you need to do that work more meaningfully? Anyone who wants to start, you go ahead, Faye.
Without getting too political, but looking at the previous governments before the current one, like I still feel it every time we try to advocate. There is a fear in queer and trans organizations, and I think it's shared in feminist movements, that if we speak out, if we're a little bit too aggressive, if we're not smiling in the right ways, that we're going to get penalized for that. And I think this government has really changed that tune and changed that narrative. But I think the elephant in the room is that we're still scared that we're going to face repercussions if we don't demand a better tomorrow. And I think we're always stuck with the we need to praise, and we do need to praise. And this government has done so much more than I would have imagined possible. That doesn't mean it's good enough. And so I think we need more permission given by government for us to be critical and for us to know that that is something that is conducive to a healthy society, a healthy movement, that we can't just allow governments to exist in a vacuum. We should be encouraged to critique. That critique informs stronger public policy.
It's never good enough, right? There's always progress to be made.
Exactly.
Yeah, and just to add to that, like as someone who's been leading a national organization in this country for 2 years, I felt this fear that I can't say anything because a significant amount of my organization's budget is federally funded. But I'm also still an activist who came to this from grassroots movements, the student movement, and I've been kind of trying to be bolder in what I say in my criticisms. And like, I remember with the federal budget, it's quoted in a Toronto Star article where I said, I'm sick and tired of queer and trans orgs being happy with crumbs. And that was a direct criticism of the federal government. Nothing happened, which I'm glad to see. But what I think is encouraging is that there is a demand, and we're feeling that the need to critique is important, just like what Faye mentioned, because it makes our government stronger if we don't do so, right? Obviously do so in a way that's respectful and acknowledges the fact that there's a working relationship between civil society organizations and government, especially if we're playing that bridge between communities and movements to the decision-making table. But I think that fear is a legitimate one, but I'm happy to see that many of us are moving past it. I think I would love to see it be coordinated for the queer and trans orgs in particular. We're working on it. But it's definitely that fear, and definitely I think lessons that we're learning from maybe older generations who've done this work of trying to not push too much. And so I think there's an intergenerational conversation to be had too between feminists who've been in the movement for a while and younger feminists about how can we do this in a way that is mutually beneficial, but still taking lessons that folks have been seeing across time that can still allow our movements to kind of push forward.
But I'd add that sometimes we have such a challenge too when we try and organize together. And we saw this in Ontario, where some of our organizations were trying to come together to lobby and to work together, but the electoral guidelines around coalitions and advertising and all of that was so incredibly daunting. And my colleagues around around the province were like, are we pushing this too far? What's going to happen here? So that kind of clarity where we want to push those boundaries and we want to be out there, but there's this lack of clarity that brings fear as well. And that stifles, because of course, we don't want to incur $100,000 fine for our organization by putting the wrong tweet out either. So that kind of clarity, I think, is going to be so much more helpful.
I think there's this real power around coalition building and bringing unlikely allies together, and really bringing, the legal sector with academia, with civil society, with labor movements, with the private sector and government. And I think when I think about advocacy, I'm like a proponent of building a culture of advocacy. Like, we can all be advocates. It doesn't need to be in our job title. It doesn't need to be part of our, quote unquote work. We can all be advocates in so many different ways. I think there's a real power if we're able to, engage different pillars of society in that work. We saw this actually with childcare, just the way labor movements were working with feminist movements. And, this has been a half-century promise of actually getting childcare in this country. And there's still a lot of work to do, but we actually saw every single jurisdiction in our country actually sign a childcare agreement. And I think there was something that happened in this pandemic where people were always collaborating, but it became even more vital and urgent. And that also I saw translate to advocacy, which was really promising. And just, organizations that work nationally, there's such a power when people coast to coast to coast are singing from the same song sheet and saying the same ask over and over again. And, unfortunately, the challenges and perils of electoral politics, at the end of the day, it matters who's in your riding, and they are the folks who send you back to Ottawa. So if you're able to actually pinpoint riding by riding and really push your message across the country, there's a lot of incredible things that can be done, but that needs to be resourced well. That's how we build power. And that's where, one of us by ourselves perhaps can't do that major systemic impact, but working together, there is that ability. And I think the childcare movement, I know there's probably a gathering for childcare movements this week in Ottawa. And I think just so much we can learn from them, and just also staying vigilant. I think that's the other piece as well. Sometimes we see progress move forward, and sometimes if it's not situated well enough, another government comes in and that work can be completely, dismantled. So we need to also figure out how do we actually entrench that good work that has been done by previous generations and our generations. Because I think that's part of the work of an advocate too, to stay vigilant, to see when we're seeing things in the environment that are like, that means actually that might be a rollback. We need to agitate and activate.
Mm-hmm. I want to stay on this thread because I would like to know what tools are in all of your toolboxes for policy advocacy. What have you found that's worked? Maybe Debbie, what's worked for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a big advocate of having multiple forms of engagement because not everyone's ready to, occupy a mayor's office. I am, but not everyone else. Yes. Some people are also maybe okay with the idea of sending an email to an MP, but are like, that's too much work. I don't want my name attached to it. And some people are probably cool with just sending a tweet and tagging someone, right? And so I'm a big advocate of multiple forms of engagement and ensuring that there's low hanging fruit that is accessible to folks who might not feel comfortable, where certain spaces aren't actually physically or accessible in other ways, to ensure that they're also engaged. And so when I worked as a campaigner, we made sure that we had these multiple forms of engagement, and CCGSD as an organization is exploring these as we continue to kind of work on our national advocacy campaigning, especially in coalition with other LGBTQ orgs. And so I'm a big advocate of ensuring that that exists because it allows the most people to engage in the way that feels most comfortable for them.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think storytelling has really been a core part of our toolkit at the YWCA, using the stories from community, from what our service users are experiencing, whether it's in terms of lack of access to housing or childcare, or whatever the issue is to have a pipeline of information from community that we can use and amplify, because sometimes the statistics don't actually derive a point home for people. It's the personal connection. And so we work quite often with our member associations and service users to tell those stories. And that's part of that coalition building and part of the amplifying those voices, because it's about what everyone's experiencing, and bringing those stories forward, which is really, I think, a big part of our toolbox. So we use that in terms of, developing videos. So even when Anjum was with the YWCA, she did a really great job of connecting with our daycare staff and parents in daycares to have them talk about the challenges that they were experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I recognize also statistics don't tell the whole story. And I know that as a journalist, but I also know that there is a lack of data in this country, right? And I'm wondering how much that impacts what you're able to do with policy advocacy.
I mean, we have next to no data on most we have more gaps, I think, in our data than we have solutions or actual, the knowledge that we need. I think that we only just got data on the number of trans folks in Canada. Not to brag, but we published a great study yesterday on trans and gender and sexual diverse young folks' experience of suicidality. And so I think a big part of it is we need to build the evidence base to communicate to stakeholders, not only the degree of severity, but also what our solutions are to address those gaps. I think that is a piece of data that we don't think about a lot, but it's something that we really struggle with. How do you cost out a solution to GBV or harassment against trans folks when you don't actually know the prevalence? And then how do we actually demonstrate to governments that our solutions will substantively impact that data? And I think that's the other piece that we struggle with, like making a case for support that speaks to different parties, and they're all going to want to hear different things, and making a case for support that stands out from everybody else in the right kinds of ways. But I think at the root of it, we still don't understand GBV beyond a simple one-story narrative of like a woman being catcalled in public. We don't have the deeper data of when and where, who is it actually impacting, what is the connection between that harassment and mental health. And so I think there is so much that we still don't know, and so much that we're still not even beginning to explore. Like I come from the mental health sector. We love evidence-based practice, which is a concept we need to debunk because it usually is serving white, cisgender, straight women, et cetera, et cetera. But we also need the data to back up our work, to showcase that our interventions are creating change, are having an impact in the lives and the well-being and overall experience of young women and gender diverse folks.
One tool in my toolbox, and I think everyone on this panel has been very active, especially in the pandemic, is around actually creating the space for our advocacy. And that's by putting it into the political discourse. That's by making it at the top of the agenda. And that's by engaging the media. Media, as Rain was talking about, storytelling, and Debbie was also talking about, the Toronto Star article, for example, post-budget. These are actually really important ways to document for the history books, like what our actual perspectives are on the decisions of the day, but also to encourage, inspire, educate, and inform the public at large to create that political will, because oftentimes that is what actually pushes an issue from the top of our agenda as a civil society to the top of the agenda of the public at large. We saw this with childcare. We saw this with so many different things during the pandemic. I think also, there's this real importance for actually sharing our perspective and having that counted and documented. And a great initiative led by Oxfam Canada has been around looking at who actually goes and deputes to Parliament when it comes to the budget. Are there enough women's rights and gender equality organizations and feminist organizations actually saying their perspective? Because oftentimes what happens is, perhaps other pillars of society are crowding out our voices. And that's where decisions are made and our voices need to be heard. So Oxfam has been doing this interesting thing where they're really pushing the government, and other civil society organizations are backing this, ask, carve out at least, X percentage of who deputes to Parliament about the budget. Have that come from feminist organizations, have that come from gender equality organizations. That's a place where we can be heard and be counted. I think another, I'm a big believer also in, I mentioned this a bit around, how different pillars of society can come together. So working at Plan International Canada, we work on children's rights and equality for girls globally and here in Canada as well. And we have a lot of youth advocates across the country, just incredible and passionate and really creative young people. And, I'm going to do a shout out to Saskatchewan. There's a Champions of Change Club in Regina. And what they've done to really tackle period poverty and period stigma is they've partnered with a local Regina-based business to create a lip gloss and to leverage that to raise funds for period poverty, but also to raise awareness about this issue across the country and across their province. And that was something, a young person reached out to a local business, they came together, they got it out in the public, and people now are buying this lip gloss across the country. And it's doing two things. It's helping to fund initiatives to address period poverty, but it's also raising awareness. And I think it's just the power of that collaboration across pillars of society and going out perhaps outside of your comfort zone. So I see that actually happening across the country with so many youth advocates and youth-led groups. And I think there's a lot that I learn from them every day. And I think there's such a power in that collaboration. And that's, I think, a tool in my toolbox and that I've seen work quite effectively.
Mm-hmm.
If I can just pass it to you. I also like, I love the potential, like to me, the young folks coming up in our movements, that I'm not calling them a tool, but they fit really nicely in our toolbox. And I think it is the question of like, how do we help them? Like, how do we leverage and build their capacity? I know like CCGSD does this a lot of our organizations do this a lot. But I think it's the next step. Like, I want to see more of those young voices writing op-eds.
Yeah.
And I think like a lot of queer and trans folks are not jumping into public media. There are very few folks who are submitting articles or taking news interviews, because there's a risk there as well. Yeah. But it doesn't take a brilliant mind to write an op-ed. And that's almost like the elephant in the room. It's a 5-paragraph essay. We learned to do it in grade 9. Yes, there's some adaptation, but trying to find more ways. I think so many folks who have so much to share don't think they have as much to share as they do, and they hold themselves back. And if we can find the tools to get those folks into the public space, the next generation is going to accomplish things that we could never believe possible. And I'm 26, and that feels weird to say.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too, just kind of keeping the momentum talking about young people. I think about the conversation CCGSD is having with queer and trans seniors, where they straight up said, if we're going to talk about young people being a tool, we're tired. You folks have the energy. Go forth when you're advocating about your issues as young people and speak about our issues that are impacting us as seniors. One, again, of our frustrations with the federal budget is that there was nothing that explicitly spoke about queer seniors and the housing crisis after what we witnessed the last 2 years in this pandemic. And that was something that we did specifically to speak to our allyship across, I guess, generations with older seniors in queer and trans communities. And I think what Faye mentioned regarding, young people writing op-eds, I'm thinking about the message that we try to relay to young folks is that you don't have to sit down and have a conversation with the Prime Minister to inform change in this country. Your school board trustees, your local municipal councilors, your coach, those are folks who impact decision making, and those people are probably most accessible to you. There are ways and tools that you have, whether it's even just an email, whether it's asking for your flag, a queer or trans flag to be raised at your school. Those are also part of the movement of building change, and it's accessible to young people. And so these are the messages that we try to relay, is that that's accessible. You can do it, right? And that will help them build the skills to where they join me in occupying mayor's offices one day, So these are the things that I think are super important when we're engaging young people, is letting them know that your energy, your skill set, and your knowledge is also educating folks, and your stories too, but also recognizing that it doesn't have to be scary, that an op-ed or an engaging with your school board trustee is something that you can also do to create change.
That intergenerational approach is beautiful, right? Like, that is just so incredible, where we have, as in this room, youth and some of us who are not so youth. I know I look fabulous, I'm over 50, but the thing is that having those conversations and sharing, like, we learn so much. Like, I mean, how many people in this room learned more about TikTok over the course of the last 2 years than ever before because of some young person in their life? And what a great platform for storytelling and for pushing issues forward, right? I think it's so important. And just recently, actually, I was connecting with one of the young women who had gone through one of Ywca's Young Women's Think Big Lead Now, Young Women's leadership programs for young women and gender diverse youth. And she went to a poverty reduction panel in her community. And as an Indigenous young woman, she was silenced, and she didn't get any space to speak on that agenda. And the people who had all the time were, older folks who were service workers, and they had all the time and she had none. And I encouraged her. I'm like, okay, we need to write an op-ed. Here's how we're going to do it. So that's one of the tools. But I said, next time also, just you can walk out and we can follow up by saying, I didn't have space in this place that was meant for me. And she's doing exactly the work of poverty reduction in the community with Indigenous youth. So if she couldn't have that space in that moment and everyone else is talking around her, yeah, hell yeah, light a fire, burn it down, right?
Yeah.
Because that's sometimes what we need to encourage, and to give the spark and to say that it's okay that you have I'm giving you space to do this. And if you need me to edit something or share information, happy to do so.
Mm-hmm. I will say, if there's anyone in here who wants to write an op-ed, email me. Any young people, and I'm 28, and that feels weird to say. So we're talking a lot about these sort of like consultation processes, and that's kind of how a lot of policy gets made, right? These processes of consultation, but who is in those rooms? Is it people with lived experience of the issues? Like who's making it into those rooms? Yeah, I mean, this may be a sensitive question. Go ahead.
Minister Ian's left, right? Okay. So I think there is a struggle because I think our governments are very good at saying the right things. Every process is community engaged. Young folks have been consulted through and through. We have an advisory, we have a table, we have a GBV council, we have all of these mechanisms. But I do think, it's folks who have paid jobs like we do who show up in those spaces. And that's always an immense privilege. And I worry, does the language, I come from co-creation, I come from co-development. We're going to design new interventions with young people, folks with lived experience, researchers, and service providers. And I think this government is moving the needle on that. But I still think there's a danger of using the word community engaged process when we aren't following through on it. I think there's a danger of using the word survivor-led if we're not following through on it. And I think a lot of the time we think that chatting with 3 people is survivor leadership. Chatting with 3 people is not survivor leadership. It's the 3 folks that were able to show up to your downtown Ottawa meeting and sit in the room with the minister and not be terrified. And so I think we are getting better at this. And I'm seeing, governments are leveraging civil society to do engagement and recognizing that we can reach community easier and better than they ever could. But that also doesn't mean that they're accountable to what they heard. And that's part of the struggle too, is they can listen and listen and listen, and listening is great. I love people who listen. But if I then see a LGBT action plan that is a paltry investment compared to what our communities need, I'm like, so you consulted with everyone, and then when it came to a cabinet conversation, we weren't prioritized. And so consultation doesn't mean engagement and doesn't mean meaningful engagement. It's a step on the process, but we need more mechanisms to hold them to what they actually hear in community. And that's when we'll start to see policies and priorities that reflect those communities.
Right, because it can cause damage too, right? In communities, like I was having a conversation with Louisa Dongo, who runs Inspiring Communities at Nova Scotia, and she was talking about this concept of the trauma it can cause in communities when they're forced to talk about their trauma, and then it doesn't even result in any policy change. We
banned conversion therapy, which is a good success, but survivors from day one were not just calling to put a piece of legislation in place. They were calling for supports for the hundreds of thousands of survivors of conversion practices who've been traumatized by horrible human beings. They need support, and legislation doesn't end conversion practices. Policies, intervention, public education. And so we promise folks the moon, and then we don't deliver anywhere near the degree of substance that would actually create change in community.
On this, so this is an example, the sort of conversion therapy advocacy you've been doing. I'd like to ask everyone else too, what's on your agenda over the next sort of year or so? What are some of the policies that you're going to be pushing for? And Ray, maybe we'll start with you as interim CEO of Ywca. You have sort of this bird's eye view of what's happening across the country. What's on your agenda?
A big part of our agenda is to move things forward on the National Action Plan on Ending Gender-Based Violence, looking for details, commitments, clarity, timelines. So that's a really big piece for us. We continue to work nationally around building housing. So our challenge with, we know what the rents are like across the country. So the YWCA is really trying to build a lot of affordable housing. And that is a challenge. And so we are working with CMHC, and looking at their policies and practices in terms of making that possible. So some of our colleagues have had real challenges in terms of getting things built, where their initial proposal to build affordable housing, maybe 38 units, 41 units, the cost of the build tripled over the course of the last 2 years. And so that's something big that we're pushing forward, is to continue on around making sure that women's housing is built, and it's affordable, accessible, and it doesn't drain our colleagues who are really just sort of advocating constantly to get things built, and have people move in and all of that. So those are the two big pieces for us, is affordable housing and ending gender-based violence.
Mm-hmm. Stephanie?
Yeah, love this question. So okay. So I have this lovely cover photo on my Facebook. It's a screenshot from a show called Days of Tomorrow. And there's an awesome Black feminist who has her quote that says, "Black women tried to tell you." And I say that because I've been engaging in Black feminist politics as soon as I was able to grasp the English language, but really as young 18-year-old who moved to Ottawa. And many of the conversations I've had with Black activists across the country have been a lot of trying to warn decision makers that there is a very growing, strong, well-resourced white supremacist movement that is homegrown, and that if we continue to do the thing that Canada loves to do, that is say, we're not the US, everything is fine here, you are blatantly ignoring the lived realities of many people in this country. And when things get bad, we will be there to say, we told you so. I say this because as someone leading an LGBTQ organization, we know that there's a direct connection and overlap between anti-LGBTQ hate, specifically anti-trans hate, and how that is a direct entry point to white supremacist radicalization in this country. We know that young people, young queer and trans youth, and we've seen this with legislation in the States, are a prime target for this witch hunt that we've seen in the States, and that is also happening here in Canada. It exists. We see it at the school board level. There are far-right groups who specifically target school board trustees to lobby that they will push for policies that are harmful to queer and trans youth. And unless we build a cohesive cross movement building that is proactive and not reactive, I think we're going to be preparing for a very scary moment in a lot of the accomplishments that feminist activism has seen in the last couple of years. That is intersectional, that's queer and trans friendly, et cetera. So what our organization is doing is we're really thinking about what are we going to do from an advocacy perspective, what conversations are we going to be having with the federal government on anti-hate legislation, where we ask them to specifically name white supremacy. There is I don't know what the fear is in naming whiteness and white supremacy as a problem, but that is why we are seeing so many of these issues, and that if we don't name it and we just think that all hate is the same and exists across the board, we're ignoring one of the foundational issues in this country that has existed for so long. And so we're hoping to build a campaign where youth are engaged to take action, again, at the school board level, and that hopefully we can build movements with the labor movement, with feminist activists, et cetera, to really push for strong anti-hate legislation that can see that queer and trans people aren't going to be at risk of what can possibly be a very scary federal government if we're not prepared in like a couple of years.
Yeah.
Just took all of my time.
Yeah.
So I would agree in full, right? And I think I'm actually I have been in the LGBT activist space for 8 years now, and I actually don't think I've ever been as scared as I am right in this moment. And I think folks don't recognize or realize that. So to add on what Debbie said, we've seen over 100 bills in the US targeting the rights of trans kids, particularly trans girls. We are also seeing that in the US, that didn't stop there. They used attacks on the bodily autonomy, and that is actually what we're talking about here. It's right to healthcare. It's accessing essential medically necessary health services. Well, it didn't stop with targeting trans people. What happened next? They came for abortion rights. They came for women's bodily autonomy. They came for critical race theory is now demonized in American schools. We often pretend that isn't happening here. We live in Ottawa. We suffered through the convoy. We saw white supremacists occupy our downtown core for a month, and our cops stood by and did nothing. We saw not only white supremacists, we saw transphobes, anti-trans groups, anti-2S LGBTQ groups hanging out in those spaces. That is what scares me in this moment. And that is what I don't think any of us have fully opened. I mean, Black feminists have been saying this for a long time. I don't think many or most of us have fully opened our eyes to the degree of backlash that is coming in the very near future. And none of us are ready for it. On the feminist movement side, I don't actually think we're as ready to come to bat for trans communities as we think we are. We're making some progress, we're making some movements, we're building coalitions. This panel is a representation of that. And the fact that the four of us know each other fairly well and have been collaborating and working together and maybe sharing each other's boards and showing up from one to the other. But I think there is a need for our feminist movements to recognize that anti-trans hate translates into misogyny. And that we have to also be willing to counter the dog whistles and the red herrings that are focused on trans and gender diverse folks, because they're going to be manipulated against cis women too. They're going to come for butch lesbians. They're going to come for gender nonconforming young folks. That is the fight that we're stepping up into right now. And the UK has been in this for 5 years. The US has been in this and it's been growing for years and years on end. We keep imagining we're better. We keep imagining we're different. I still have 16-year-old trans kids who crash on my couch because they don't feel safe going to the women's shelters. And so we need to open our eyes to the degree of hate in this country, the degree of momentum we still need to build, and the fact that many of us in our communities haven't recognized that we are in crisis mode. And I feel like I am in crisis mode every day. And I would love a day where we weren't, but we need to be together in fighting that hate. And it starts with recognizing that it's rooted in white supremacy. It's rooted in colonialism. And most of transphobia is rooted ground for that. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to just soak in what you said. And I think just really recognizing that, we can't really talk about, like, there's been a lot of conversations over the last number of months around recovery. How can we recover in a climate like this? And I think this is something that's incumbent on all of us. We can't, none of us can thrive if not all of us are thriving. And, the things that impact any one of us impact us all. And I think that is my hope with this pandemic, people recognizing those interconnections and what all of you have, brought to the fore for all of us to recognize and sit with. Right now, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about and our team has been thinking about is how do we actually give folks the tools to talk back, to share their impact, share the impact of what's happening, to share their perspectives. And right now we've been doing a lot of work around building the confidence of young people across the country to advocate, to share, to fight for systemic change. And it's everything from building skills and knowledge about the issues, but also creating the spaces for young people to connect with one another. Because as we know, any one of us can make an impact, but our impact is so much greater when we can come and join forces and share our knowledge and share our skills. But also creating those pathways for young people to actually speak truth to power and bringing them directly in spaces where decisions are being made. So that's been a lot of our work right now around building the confidence, building the knowledge and skills. And I don't know if folks have read this article. It came out a couple months ago, and it was around this idea of the impostor syndrome. Just wanted to talk with folks here, like, has anyone experienced that impostor syndrome before? Yeah.
Right now.
Yeah. And so it was this really interesting article because what it talked about was that this imposter syndrome that you feel is manufactured because many of the spaces that we sit in were not built for us. And so there is actually people who are benefiting off the status quo, and there's actually nothing wrong with us. We are more than capable and more than capable of actually giving incredible impact and giving our incredible insights, but the systems around us were not built for us. So if we feel a sense of nervousness, if we feel a sense of hostility, if we feel a sense of not that sense of belonging that Rain talked about, that's not actually anything to do with us. That's the system. And what we need to do is dismantle where we need to, create that change where we need to, but It has nothing to do with us. And so that was a real aha moment, because sometimes you feel that sense of isolation and nervousness, and you feel like you're the only one feeling that. But actually, all of us are experiencing it. It's actually a symptom of something larger: white supremacy, racial injustice, and misogyny, and all these different pieces where that was the foundation for the current systems in place. And I think for me right now, just thinking about what are the next things that are on our radar as an organization. So in the international cooperation, global development space, we've been talking a lot about the triple threat of COVID, climate, and conflict. And we're seeing that play out even in the last 6 months. And in many ways, folks have said the climate crisis is a dress rehearsal for some of the things that we've seen already in the COVID-19 pandemic. So for us, we've been thinking a lot about, a lot of the climate change impacts that are seen globally. Folks in the global north are most responsible, but are the least willing to contribute. And global south is experiencing those challenges disproportionately. And so we've been doing a lot of work around the loss and damage agenda, and really working with youth-led activists like Ineza Grace, who is a Rwandan-based activist who leads the Youth Loss and Damage Coalition, and actually creating spaces for thought leadership and using our contributions that we can make as an organization to amplify and put forward the ideas of young activists all around the world. And I think that's what we need more than ever. There's incredible ideas, but people are not hearing them or listening. And as folks here have shared, we need to all be listening to those ideas. And I think each of us as an organization, we have different skills and assets and contributions we can make. How are you working with youth-led advocates or other equity-seeking groups with their activism and amplifying that? I think that's something that I'd love to see more of as a feminist movement in Canada and globally, because that's where we actually will see that systemic change being pushed forward, if we're actually amplifying the ideas that have not received their fair attention, their fair share. So those are some of the things that we've been working on. And I think that's where I see a lot of hope and optimism. And that's where I see us hopefully creating that better change that we're hoping to push forward into the world.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Angela. I love that. Before we move on to the next question, I just want to quickly ask, what is a policy intervention or a couple that you would like to see to combat this connected misogynist, white supremacist, anti-trans movement that we're seeing?
So wait, I always feel like I'm jumping in too quickly, but I always have something to say. It's the struggle of me. So I think like on the anti-trans side in particular, I think it does. So women and gender equality, it is now women and gender equality. So let's see the gender equality in that a little bit more.
Yeah.
And again, like I'm the first to say this government listens to trans folks more than the last one did. But again, I actually want grant funding to monitor anti-trans hate, to monitor dog whistles, to monitor the tactics of these groups. Everyone knows the name Barbara Kay, maybe? Okay, National Post columnist who will be a megaphone for every transphobe in the country as best she can be. Please don't tell her I said her name. I don't want to get sued. But how are we connecting the dots between the Rebel News, the post-millennial, between some of these really powerful columnists and anti-2S LGBTQ advocates? We can't respond to a crisis that we can't track and begin to monitor and understand. And then we can create the tools that debunk all of the dog whistles, that demonstrate how, again, it starts with trans rights, then it goes for bodily autonomy. But we need to be monitoring, and then we need to be investing in local organizations. And this is what our queer and trans organizations have been fighting for a long time. Our organizations are already on the front lines combating gender-based violence. They are the ones who are answering the call when a queer kid is kicked out of their home. Imagine if we could invest in them, because hate is gonna come and go. It's gonna rise and it's always gonna be scary. But if we can build queer and trans organizations that are vibrant, that are sustainable in local communities, that is the silver bullet that will actually change those communities. But it starts with substantial funding, and it starts with ongoing funding. I am tired of jumping from 6-month to 1 year to 18-month contracts or budgets or projects that don't cover my admin costs and don't enable me to actually, tangibly and sustainably fight this kind of hate. We need a new funding model.
Absolutely. I have an amazing colleague, Denise Christopherson, who's the CEO of Ywca Hamilton, who constantly says, we are not projects. We are not projects. Our organizations need core funding to keep doing the work. You know, that's absolutely where we are.
Yeah, you're not projects, you're movements, right? Like,
Absolutely.
And I just think about the fact that civil society is what's been saving us in this pandemic and has been the backbone of our society and is actually there when public policy is no longer fit for purpose. Where do people go? They come to our organizations. And I think that's a real missed opportunity of government around not adequately resourcing this essential life source again for society. I think also about the fact that it's actually a symptom of this broader devaluing of care work, which in many ways the nonprofit and charitable sector is at the forefront of. And I think that's something also that we need to think about. Paid care work, unpaid care work, all of that needs to be resourced appropriately, valued and sustained. And it's also where, when you think about like trust in society, it's nonprofit and the charitable sector that have actually continued to sustain that level of trust. And it's other parts of society that have diminished in their trust. And I think we are that honest broker, that ability to connect communities, as Debbie talked about, that bridging function. And that needs to be resourced appropriately. And I think we need to also think about how do we diversify our funding models as well. There's real power in looking at, small scale contributions where everyone can give their part. And I think sometimes that's something that we've also seen to really ensure that we can withstand, for example, political changes in government and ensuring that our organizations can continue to go on. So I think there's real power and also the power of, individual small donations, building that movement, building, bringing people together into our mission of what our organization's about. And that's where storytelling, for example, comes in.
mhm.
And just to add, just to answer your question around that like immediate response to anti-LGBTQ and white supremacist hate, I think we need to I think those of us in civil society, many of us who also exist in communities as individuals, I think we need to do more of a better job of giving credit to our grassroots movements and shifting the language that we use and shifting the way that we think about policy. If the last 2 years has shown anything, it has shown that something as simple, and some people might have different feelings about this, the concept of defunding the police, completely shifting the way we even think about what is possible with how institutions that uphold white supremacy, the same institutions that are directly connected to the white supremacist radicalization we see in this country, they mentioned it. The police in this country stood by with a welcoming mat while these people came here and occupied the city for a year. So grassroots movements have forced us to think about policy different. And I think we need to give credit to that, because if we don't, we end up doing that thing where we can forget, even as civil society folks, forget about the links between institutions that are embedded in this country that are still part of the problem. So even if we have legislation that reduces radicalization of like young men, for example, we still have institutions that uphold white supremacy that are well-funded, well-resourced, and we see this at the municipal level, provincially and federally. And so I just wanted to add that we need to give credit to that, we need to give space to that, and we need to acknowledge that if we really want to see shift and change and things like hate, it's going to mean being bold in our policy and not being afraid to say, this is something that needs to be addressed, even if it means you're the only voice that's yelling at it or yelling that or speaking that. There is a big fear in our decision makers about this, and it's a challenge that many activists on the ground, Black activists, I'm thinking of the immigrant community that I come from in Brampton, who have seen the direct results of over-policing and what it has done to our communities. And that when we point the connection to all these things and there's still a hesitancy to change that, what message does that say to these people whose social locations speak to their lived experience that make them an expert? So just wanted to add that because I feel it often is missing in these conversations and we need to center it.
I'm going to jump on that and also share that, there are policies in the tech sector and social media that need to be addressed because that's where these groups are coming together. And I think that often that's ignored. That's where hate is happening. And there's the social media platforms that we know of, but I can tell you that so through a project that YWCA has called Block Hate, we've also learned about things that are happening that are far more frightening on the dark web, right? Where your what you give into certain platforms in terms of hate speech allows you access to more, right? Allows you to into that radicalization. And I think that's the dark web, but I think there's a lot of spaces that we already know about and that are not being policed, that are not, our policies aren't driving and making social media the Wild West accountable as well. And that I think is really important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, so if I can jump off something Debbie said, I think like, I want our feminist sector to be speaking about defunding the police from our hearts. And I think that is something that we haven't been willing to do. And I think you started, like, why aren't we and what's holding us back? And I think part of that is, I think we all struggle with the point at which we almost are encouraged to become gatekeepers of what is good and viable public policy. And I feel that all of the time. I feel like I came from like slut walk organizing, like protest organizing is my world and is still how I relate to much of my work. But it does feel like when you get into spaces, when you begin to have a platform and the ability to make noise, there's a pressure to only push for certain things. And it's only the things that fall in their strategic plan that have been confirmed and affirmed, that we know that we can speak to the public, and that the public will immediately say, oh yeah, it makes sense to give more funding to women's organizations. And like, again, yeah, and we still have to fight for that, and governments don't. But I actually worry about the role that we sometimes play in determining which policies are viable, acceptable policies for us to be fighting for. And I think a lot of us are silent on the ones that challenge our own organizations. And defunding the police it's one that is going to cause problems in our organizations. Our boards might not all agree, our volunteers might not all agree, or our donors might not all agree.
Right.
But sometimes we have to make sacrifices. And sometimes we have to choose defunding the police over some of our wealthy white donors.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That was really powerful. I'd like to talk about international policy because we haven't touched on that at all. And I know, Anjum, you sort of recently moved into the international feminist space. What is on your agenda right now? What's really important in the international feminist policy space?
Yeah, so we just came off of a couple months ago, CSW 66, which actually had climate change as a standalone theme for the first time. And it was really exciting to see, just even that being talked about through a gender equity, gender equality lens, because I think people sometimes don't always see those interconnections. Just one manifestation of what's happening with climate change and how it's impacting girls and young women and gender diverse people across Canada and around the world is the current global hunger crisis. So girls are often the first to go hungry and the last to eat. They face in the face of the global hunger crisis some of the gravest human rights violations. So we're seeing child marriage increasing. We're seeing economic insecurity. We're seeing job loss, and that's actually happening in tandem with the COVID-19 pandemic and also in conflict and fragile situations around the world. So that's been a big area of focus, both what's happening in the Horn of Africa and what's happening in Sahel. And I think that's something that's not talked about enough, actually. There is a global hunger crisis, and we're not seeing that on the media every single day in the way that it needs to be and it deserves to be. So that's been a big area of focus for us through a gender transformative lens. So not only, looking at the root causes of gender inequality and looking at how we can start to see not only real material changes in people's day-to-day lives, but also how are we changing social norms? How are we also changing our systems and our policies and our budgets to be more gender responsive? So those are some of the things that we've been thinking a lot about around climate change, around the global hunger crisis. We've been talking a lot also about education. So in our country, we've seen, for example, the disruptions that have happened to education. And we've seen that actually has had a gendered impact, a racialized impact, an impact on low-income communities. And really through an equity lens, we've seen so many equity-seeking groups being impacted. That's also the case globally as well. So that's actually something that we've been working a lot around how we can support access to education. Education is a right, even in times of emerging, especially so. So we've been doing a lot of work around, how do we also transform education in this current climate that we're in? There's a a big focus on education in the upcoming United Nations General Assembly. So we'll be doing a lot of work in the lead up around education through a gender transformative lens. For us, and maybe I'll speak to some of the work that I did also at Ywca Canada around a feminist recovery. I think, one of the things I'd love to see more of, and we've seen this in many ways, and I'm really excited to see the work that Equal Futures Network will do to bring us all closer together, domestic and global gender equality movements and feminist movements, because they're actually not two separate ones. They're actually one and the same, because again, gender inequality anywhere is a gender inequality here in Canada as well. And one of the things that we actually saw during the pandemic was how there were severe gendered impacts across Canada, across many countries around the world. And one of the first jurisdictions to actually not only identify that and document that, but actually come up with a feminist recovery plan was the state of Hawaii. And so that's actually what inspired some of the work around Canada's feminist economic recovery plan. So that was actually the first economic recovery plan of its kind globally. And then, once that was published, we actually saw other interesting feminist recovery plans across the country as well. I know in the city of Ottawa, great work was being done from City for All Women initiative. Great work was being done in British Columbia. We were also seeing that same energy and excitement in Niagara and many parts of the country. And I think what that experience taught me is that there's real power in sharing your ideas, sharing your activism, because you don't know what that might unlock. And a clear example of this is, and Rain and I were talking a bit before the panel started, about 10, 15 years ago, it was actually at a place like CSW that people started talking about a national action plan to end gender-based violence in Canada. That was actually something other countries around the world were doing, but that was still not present in Canada. And so that was actually what happened in that global setting, that we were able to, feminist movements were able to see that and bring that home. And I think there's real power in creating spaces for convening, bringing spaces where people from all walks of life around the globe can come together. And that's what I'm really keenly excited for right now in my current role, bridging that global, national spaces for gender equality. And so that's just a bit of what's on the horizon. But I think what is similar across all those spaces is really recognizing the need for gender transformative action. It can't just be gender responsive. It can't just be gender aware. But what we really need to do is unpack and address the root causes of inequality. And they go back to what Debbie talked about. Fundamentally, it's about power as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's almost a cliche at this point, but what COVID-19 taught us is the interconnectedness between domestic and global, and between everyone globally. So Faye, what are you seeing in terms of that connection for you, or what are priorities for you internationally?
I mostly work domestically, 95% of the time. But when I glimpse into the international world, I think about the work that we could and should be doing around solidarity for countries that still have, in particular, homophobic and transphobic laws on the books. And I think that we often imagine that the world around has changed a lot more than it has. And so I think there's work like LGBT Rights Ghana. How are we supporting grassroots organizations and leveraging the tools and resources that we have to even directly funding those groups. I had a call yesterday with All Out, and they're an international LGBTQ mobilizer. They don't do the policy, they don't do the GR, they do we're going to reach as many people with as many crowd-funded donations as we can, and we're going to take that lump of money and give it to those local organizations doing the work. So I think we can explore that in bigger ways. And again, recognize that our Canadian idea of gender and sexuality is so divorced from one another. I see feminist movements and queer movements as hanging out in the same space and always having been. And so I think we can challenge ourselves there too. The last thing I'll say is the anti-gender movement, which is gender ideology, the groups that are trying to take the rights away from trans and gender diverse folks. It is globally funded, it is American funded, and they are taking tactics and interventions from every jurisdiction they can and seeing if they fit in places like Canada and the US. And so I think we need to be aware of where that money is coming from. We need to track those funds. But we also can't pretend that this is an accident, that rising hate, that the specific approaches that white supremacist groups bring to Canada, they aren't just attempts in a local jurisdiction. Yes, that is homegrown hate, but it is also homegrown hate that is looking for every example of success around the world that they can. And so we need to be as globally aware of those movements and their tactics and the successful counters to them as those groups are of successes and tactics in favor of hate.
Debbie?
Yeah, love this question. Foreign policy analyst by training.
Yeah.
And I'm also a Ghanaian Canadian. So for many folks who have a hyphen with their Canadianness, I exist across boundaries. My experience exists across boundaries. My queerness, my Blackness, and my womanhood exist across boundaries. And so when I think about what matters to me, but also what my organization is engaging in, what are key policy areas I think the government should be focusing on, I think they all are in like the same bubble. Faye kind of touched on many of them, considering the fact that, you know, around the world, there are still laws that were, and I'll speak to my home country as an example, a law in particular that was introduced in the 1800s by the British colonial government that still exists, that criminalizes unnatural carnal knowledge, which I don't even know if folks know what that even means, but it's interpreted by the state as being sodomy or homosexual acts. And that is having a direct impact on LGBTQ people in my home country. Now that there is a coordinated effort from far-right groups in the States to introduce legislation that further punish identity now. So Ghana has introduced in August it's a family values bill, but when you read it, it wasn't homegrown. And I think it goes back to looking at how some of our most positive social justice movements have been transnational. And I often speak about my feminism being transnational, but hate as well has been a transnational thing that we've seen. We've seen this in Uganda, we're seeing it in Ghana now. And Ghana is an interesting case because it is seen as like a democratic, like golden child in Western Africa. And, you know, Canada has a very specific bilateral relationship with Ghana. And if this law can successfully pass in a country like my home country, it's fair game for every single country in the continent. And that's scary. As someone who's, you know, my empowerment as a queer person, I don't know, it's hard to describe, but when I see the activism of those back home, that gives me the license to be as proud as I can be in this country. And what happens in our home countries for many people who exist in diaspora groups, it informs what we experience here. And I think that often gets missing in the conversation. And I remember when I worked at Global Affairs, often talking about the engagement with diaspora groups on the policy development practice. Because when we don't look at that, we ignore the fact that things that happen in countries around the world have a direct impact on people here. And we saw that when the introduction of this law came in, queer and trans youth that are Ghanaian in Canada were scared. We saw the shift in the conversation that our parents were having with us, a shift in what was happening in our churches. And that is why, you know, even Canada's response to LGBTQ issues has to be intersectional if we're not looking at what it means for Black and Brown kids who are first or second generation. And then what our foreign policy looks like, where we're actually investing grassroots activism so that it's not looking like a Western country is imposing anything, because that also gets weaponized by the haters, but it's supporting not organic grassroots movements, the same way we should be doing that here. Like, it is all happening at the same time. It's a conversation in itself. And I think what my organization is hoping to do is actually partner with Global South organizations working on LGBTQ issues to showcase these connections and the role that those of us who are, racialized and, first or second generation queer kids here, how much we can work in solidarity with those who are in our home countries, and how very much so being a Black queer kid in Canada means the success and the longevity and the safety of queer people in our home countries and home villages back home. And so that's what we're doing, and that's what I'm passionate about. But I think it's really important to recognize that, these issues are national, they're transnational. the pushback, the backlash is transnational, and our response has to be very coordinated as well, because if not, it's going to get really scary. So, yeah.
So for the YWCA, we have really had over the last few years, a big internal focus around looking at supporting Indigenous colleagues, friends, communities in a bigger way. So responding to the calls, the recommendations for the Truth and Reconciliation actions. And that was in place, sort of not a stopgap measure, but we have about 100 YWCAs internationally. And so we also have we play a big supportive role for our colleagues internationally through something called our International Cooperation Committee, which is really about funding some of our organizations that are doing grassroots work in community, identifying work, like Andrew said, around conflict, climate change, and all of those pieces are happening. So we're actually really excited to start doing more work with our international YWCAs in the coming years, starting with next week hosting a colleague who's going to be giving us an update on where we can be supporting our international colleagues in Palestine, for example, whether it's with sanctions, with funding support, or supporting them in terms of policy at international stages like CSW.
And I think you both just answered my follow-up question in talking about partnerships with grassroots organizations, but how might Canada do this feminist foreign policy in a way that is not colonial? Perhaps a sensitive question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a good question. It's hard, right? Like, I think we have to admit that we are grown in white supremacy and colonialist culture. Like, I have a tea set. I have multiple tea sets. Not that I'm distilling it down to tea, but just that it's unfortunately how we work. YWCA itself is a legacy organization. We've been around for over 150 years. And so constantly looking at how we're doing work is important, and looking at the impact of that legacy is important, and bringing it down to communities and taking the bullshit out. And I think that's really what's so important. And I don't know if we're all even doing it right. I don't think we are. I think we're all struggling through it. And if there are organizations that I think are saying, yep, we've completely been able to take colonialism and white supremacy out of our organization completely, amazing, right? And I think that maybe those organizations are Indigenous organizations for sure, but we're all struggling against it because we're all still looking for funding from the federal government and from donors and. So I think we're struggling with it. I really don't think that anyone is doing it right. Like, if there's somebody in this room who's doing it right, please share. Because I really think that it's an area that we're all still struggling, and I think we're going to have to make mistakes, and we're going to have to be right with those mistakes and fix them, and have the conversations that are hard, in terms of doing this right. Really blanket statement, but
yeah, but I would echo the same sentiment, right? It's just by virtue of the fact that we're funded by the federal government, by virtue that many of us have to operate under, the Corporations Act for nonprofits. Those are colonial mechanisms that are put in place to legitimize our organizations, right? And so even if our organizations are in partnership with someone in the Global South, there are going to be rules and policies in place, and Global Affairs has many of them when it comes to their funded projects. And it's really hard to unravel those without ringing the alarm when it comes to fiduciary risk.
Right.
And so when I think of resource and grassroots organizations in the Global South and the way that can be done with the least amount of colonial brouhaha in the background, it's hard, as Rain mentioned, because Canada as a country, as governments change, they all have priorities. And so when they cut a check there's something behind that, right? They just don't do it because we have this money, we're just going to throw it here. And with that will require something, whether it's an announcement to position Canada to look good in the global stage, whether it's because a priority is, we want to look more feminist, it's going to have some sort of connection to coloniality. I think the best approach, and this is something that I still want to learn, so if you folks have done it, please let me know, is when I think of feminist fundraising or feminist funding, I think of so many different grantors around the world. I think of Frida Feminist Fund. I think of the Equality Fund that's located here, and their home base is here in Ottawa, of the different ways in which they've been incorporating like intersectional frameworks in their funding and what lessons we can learn, and even Canada can learn about funding grassroots movements in the global South. But yeah, I think it's a long unlearning journey for a lot of us. And I think what it just requires is us listening and actually recognizing that anything that's tied to the government is going to be tied to colonialism in some way. And if you don't believe that, we can have a conversation after this.
I think it's also about and I think I love how you talked about YWCA as a YWCA board member, but it is it's being honest about our pasts and honest that we are legacies. And everyone's a legacy of somebody and something, but most of us in this space are probably legacies of parents who were settlers, whose parents were settlers, whose parents were settlers. And so I think we have to start with recognizing the depths of colonialism in ourselves and the fact that it is so easy to continue that legacy. But if we are I think it's taken us so long to be even able and willing to name it. But that naming of it starts the conversation. And I think it changes the approach. And it means that we walk into a space recognizing that we're not just walking into that space alone, but we're walking into that space as a continuation of a colonial institutional legacy. And we need to be willing to own that and to own people who will just never engage with us. I think the grassroots is not always going to love our work and our organizations, and it's not their job to love our work and our organizations. It's our job to be held accountable to them and by them. But I think it's also recognizing that everyone has the right to say, I'm not engaging with colonial constructs, and it's our responsibility as advocates, as policy stakeholders to be okay with that, and to also think about why and what it means, and what in our work is still making folks and making grassroots organizations and Indigenous organizations hesitant to engage with us, because there is that hesitancy and they have every right to it. And we can't expect them to come to the table if we are the continuation of those legacies.
Mm-hmm. I think also a lot about coherence. What is said in one global stage by Canada, the government of Canada, what is actually done domestically, and us as advocates in this room, as folks in civil society, starting to hold them to account to what they're saying publicly, globally, and also what's happening domestically. And an example of this, right now, Canada is a co-chair of the Beijing 25+ Action Coalition on Feminist Movements and Leadership. So they are right now pushing forward and really supporting, resourcing feminist movements and leadership. If that is something that is part of their global stance, what is being done here domestically? And I think really encouraging that coherence between Canada, at the G7 and the G20, and also ensuring that that same type of investment and attention is being done domestically. So that's something I think we can all start to look at, to see where that coherence is lacking, and pointing that out and holding government to account. I think another opportunity for us, frankly, as folks sitting currently in what is considered a G7 nation, is that as a government, Canada has a lot of sway at all of these different tables. And one of the things we've been doing a lot around and starting to think about, because we want to get this right and get the foundational pieces right, is how do we start to link grassroots youth advocates in Canada who are passionate on issues such as climate change, and connecting them with young people, for example, in Egypt, that's hosting the COP27 in November, and starting to make those linkages so we can start to see that that influencing, that advocacy work happening in countries that hold a lot of sway at those global spaces. That's what our contribution can be as folks who are on this land, pushing a nation that actually has quite a significant amount of power and making sure they're moving in the right direction. Canada, for example, sits on the board of the Green Climate Fund. And right now, a lot of countries, especially in the global south, want the Green Climate Fund to put more money towards adaptation, to put more money towards grassroots feminist organizations. That's something that young people in Canada can push the Canadian government on, because they have that influence and sway as folks that could re-elect a government back in power or not. And I think just wanted to share, as someone who's really focused on youth leadership, is that millennials and Gen Z make up the largest proportion of the electorate. And I think that's something that as, in the years and decades to come, that is going to be increasingly a larger and larger influential group. And I think there's real power in that. So I'd also, encourage organizations in this room to start to think about, what is your youth engagement strategy? How are you working in partnership and allyship with organizations that are doing incredible work, but could do even more if there was an ability to partner in an authentic and meaningful way? That's something that we've been really promoting and looking at how we can start to support and amplify.
Thanks, Anjum. So we have just about 5 minutes left, which is such a shame because I could listen to you all talk all day, seriously. But I just want to ask a couple of quick questions to wrap us up. So first is, what is a project or an initiative that you're working on that you're really excited about? What should everyone watch for from you? And the second is, what is one thing everyone here can do today, this week, this month to push for more equitable, more gender transformative policy? Rain?
So something that I'm really excited about that we're working on is our Block Hate project. We've been working with a number of youth as part of our Disrupt and Dismantle Fellowship. And they are working on a really amazing project that they're going to be launching in the fall to counter hate speech. And so really excited about that. But I actually am gonna shift the question a little bit, because I don't want to think about policy, even though I know this is the space. I want to come back to you as individuals and what you're going to do and what you're going to do as individuals to shift conversations, to bring in youth in conversations, to support and move them forward in a better understanding. So I'm going to challenge you to, over the course of the next week, bring someone with you. Bring someone with you in conversation, whether it's an ally, whether it's a young person, whether you have a quick conversation with someone, but do something individually, not as your organization. Because I think we're all doing really good work. You're here in this space, you're here in this room, and I know that you're going to be motivated and jazzed and move forward and be even greater in the work that you do. But I want to encourage you to bring someone along. That's my thing.
So one project that the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity is excited about, it's not officially announced yet, but it will be soon, is a really exciting project on comprehensive sexuality education across the country, and giving tools to educators who are still very scared to teach sex ed, but even more so afraid to teach it in a way that affirms queer and trans young people. We're really excited about what that project and what can come out of it, as well as some future campaigning that might be able to result of that in about a year or two. And we're going to be working with Wisdom to Action, which is Faye's organization, on that. And it's going to be really exciting to see some conversations shift within the school board level across this country on how curricula and education plays a key role in ending discrimination. In terms of what you as individuals can do, and I know many of us are coming from different civil society organizations, and we talked about power. We talked about how power can make us feel comfortable, even for those of us who've been working in activist movements for a very long time. I think a lesson that my rugby coach, and I played rugby for this school at Carleton, taught me that I carry with me to my activism, and I don't even think he knows that. He taught us this for the game, and I was like, no, I'm carrying it with me everywhere, is to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. So if this is in your board meeting space, whether this is with talking to a decision maker that you've never spoken to before, talking to conservative MPs is challenging, but you can do it. Be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I can guarantee you, once you lean into that, you'll be very surprised with what your advocacy could look like.
So I'm gonna hint at two projects. So the first one is that we, thanks to Women and Gender Equality Canada, we have a safer project, which a lot of UCA Halifax is on and CCGSD is working with us, and we'll bring y'all into it at some point. But it's to support feminist organizations, youth-serving organizations, and to us LGBTQ organizations to build their capacity to identify and address gender-based violence. Specifically as it impacts queer and trans young folks. And we've got free training available for feminist and youth serving orgs. You can go to saferproject.ca to learn more, or Wisdom to Action, and sign up to our newsletter for more info. The second one is there's going to be a new, very angry, very loud gay nonprofit coming into this country soon. And I don't have a name for it yet. We're still going through a branding process, but we've had a lot of fun being loud as a business on queer and trans advocacy. Imagine what we'll be able to do when we can fundraise. Now, in terms of what y'all can do, I think I spoke at the start about how I loathe the separation we create between feminist and queer and trans organizations. So my ask to all of y'all, when you go back to your work or your workplaces, your jobs, email the local gay org. Email the local queer and trans community leaders, build those local relationships, because a lot of the time, in my impression, the feminist orgs are the big fish in the room. They have some resourcing, never enough, but our queer and trans organizations don't have HR departments or comms people. They have like the volunteers who run the peer group. And so leverage what you can for them. And I'm gonna pass it to Anjum for the last 9 seconds. I'm so sorry.
Sure, no, it's hard to follow because just incredible advice and insights. I think for us, one of the projects I'm quite excited by is our initiative called The Power Within. So right now at our organization, we're on a mission to activate the global citizenship of young people across the country and unlock their leadership. And we know that when young people feel confident and have a high sense of self-esteem and body confidence, that does wonders for their leadership trajectory down the line. So The Power Within is our early intervention, working with young people as young as 10 to really support them in that self-esteem journey. So right now we're doing a lot of work with school boards across the country. We're doing a public engagement campaign. We're actually right now recruiting for our task force for representation. So that's of interest, definitely come talk to me afterwards. But really, we're interested in building the capacity of young people to have these conversations, ensure that we can support them in their leadership journey, and also look at the systemic change that is needed to really ensure a more a safe society where people feel that sense of self-esteem and body confidence. So that's one initiative that we're working on that's quite exciting and is our early intervention. With respect to what you can all do, so there's an organization called Informed Opinions that has been looking at the significant gender disparity in who is actually quoted in the media and whose voice actually shows up in the op-ed pages. So I know many of my fellow panelists have talked about this, but your voice matters and your perspective on the issues of the day need to be heard. So I would encourage you, if you've never done it before, write an op-ed on an issue that matters to you, maybe an issue that has been something that you've talked about here at this summit, for example, this conference. It's really important for our voices to be out there because that's actually what creates the space for all of our advocacy to thrive when that political window is open, when that policy window is open, and public discourse is one of the ways that we can make that happen.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you all for your honesty, for cutting the bullshit. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone watching. Thank you to Equal Futures Network for having us. And it is now lunchtime. So go head to the atrium to grab your lunch, and then we'll welcome you back at 1 p.m.